Sometimes life hands you nothing but dust, empty pockets, and one last chance to matter. 61-year-old cowboy Emmett Granger was down to $20 silver and a worn-out donkey when he bought a cave house by the river that nobody wanted. Cursed. The locals whispered, haunted by bad luck and broken dreams. But inside those cold stone walls, he discovered something that would change everything. The carved story of a runaway slave who'd built this sanctuary with hope in his heart and freedom in his calloused hands. What started as one old cowboy's final refuge became a haven for the forgotten. Could a place born from one man's dream of freedom become home for all who've lost their way? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The saddle had been with Emmett Granger for 23 years. The leather was cracked and worn smooth in places where his legs had gripped it through countless days in the high country, and the horn bore the scars of 1,000 ropes pulled taut. It sat now across Junebug's back, cinched tight, but riding easy on the little grey donkey who'd learned long ago to carry the weight without complaint. That saddle was worth maybe $8 if he could find someone fool enough to buy it. And it represented just about everything Emmett had left in this world that held any value at all. Well, that and the donkey herself. Emmett had found Junebug 8 years back, or more accurately, she'd found him. A scraggly foal with oversized ears and knobby knees, abandoned by the side of a trail in New Mexico territory. Her mother had likely died or been stolen, and the foal was too young to survive alone. Emmett had been riding for the Triple Bar Ranch then, moving a small herd of cattle through rough country, and every practical bone in his body said to keep riding. A foal was just another mouth to feed, another problem he didn't need, but he'd stopped anyway. Climbed down from his horse, approached the trembling creature, and spent an hour coaxing her to take water from his hat. By evening, she was following him like a shadow. By the end of that cattle drive, she had a name, and Emmett had a companion who asked nothing of him but a bit of grain and the occasional scratch behind those ridiculous ears. Now, in the late summer of 1886, Junebug was all the family Emmett had left. He was 61 years old, though he felt closer to 80 on the bad mornings when his back seized up and his knees protested the simple act of standing. His face was weathered brown and creased deep from 4 decades spent under the sun. His hair, what was left of it beneath his battered hat, had gone silver-grey years ago. His hands were gnarled and calloused, the knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never set quite right. He stood just under 6 feet tall, but the years had begun to curve his spine, pulling him earthward the way time does to all men who spend their lives bent over work. He'd been a cowboy since he was 17 years old. Before that, he'd been an orphan, raised in a church home in Kansas until he was old enough to be turned out to make his own way. The ranches had been his education, his home, his purpose. He'd worked from Texas to Montana, following the herds and the seasons, sleeping under stars more often than under roofs. He'd been good at it once, maybe even excellent, quick with a rope, steady with a horse. Reliable when the work turned hard and dangerous, but ranching was a young man's game, and Emmett was no longer young. 3 months ago, the foreman at the Triple Bar had called him into the office. Dom Henderson, a man 15 years Emmett's junior, had sat behind the desk with the uncomfortable expression of someone about to deliver bad news to a friend. "Emmett," he'd said, not meeting his eyes, "the owner's been talking about bringing in some younger men. Paying less, you understand. It's not about your work. You've been solid. But the numbers are, well, the numbers are what they are." Emmett had nodded, understanding everything that wasn't being said. He was too old, too slow, too expensive to keep on. There were always younger men willing to work for less, eager men with strong backs who didn't need extra. Time in the mornings to work the stiffness out of their joints. He'd been paid out his wages, $47 for 3 months' work, and had ridden away from the Triple Bar with Junebug, trailing behind on a lead rope, carrying his bedroll and the few possessions he'd accumulated over a lifetime. By the time he'd bought supplies for the road and paid for a few nights in boarding houses along the way, That $47 had dwindled to $23. His entire life's savings, if you could call it that. He drifted southwest through Colorado and into Utah territory, following the Green River, because it was as good a direction as any when you had no particular place to be. The small towns along the way all looked the same. Dusty streets, false front buildings, men and women going about their business with purpose, while he passed through like a ghost. The town of Riverbend was no different, except that this was where his money finally ran out and he was forced to stop. It was a small settlement, maybe 300 souls, perched where the Green River made a long, sweeping bend around a rocky bluff. There was a main street with the usual assortment of businesses, a general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, a small hotel with a few rooms above a restaurant. Beyond the main street, scattered houses spread out in no particular pattern, and beyond those, the land returned to sage and rock and the endless patience of the desert. Emmett had been sitting in the general store, nursing a cup of coffee he'd bought for 2 cents, when he saw the notice tacked to the board near the door. It was handwritten on brown paper. The ink faded, but still legible. Property for sale. Cave dwelling, riverside location. 4 miles north, furnished, water access. Immediate occupancy tax sale. $20 or best offer, inquire at land office. He'd read it 3 times. Then asked the store owner about it. The man behind the counter, a thin fellow with spectacles and thinning hair, had shaken his head slowly. That old place? Been abandoned for years. Built right into the rock face, down by the river. Nobody wants it. Folks say it's cursed or haunted or just plain bad luck. The county took it for unpaid taxes and has been trying to sell it for next to nothing, but no takers. Why's that? Emmett had asked. The store owner shrugged. Story goes that strange people lived there over the years. Drifters, runaways, folks you wouldn't want for neighbors. Last family that tried to settle it left after one winter. Said the place gave them nightmares. The cave goes back deep into the rock, and there's a feeling about it that isn't natural. Or so they claim. Personally, I think it's just that it's isolated and odd, and people prefer normal houses to holes in the ground. Emmett had sat with that information for a while, then asked where he could find the land office. The clerk at the land office had been even less enthusiastic. He was a young man, maybe 25, with ink stains on his fingers and a nervous disposition. When Emmett inquired about the cave property, the clerk had pulled out a dusty ledger and flipped through it with obvious reluctance. This one? He'd said, pointing at an entry. Been on the books for 6 years. County wants $20 for it, but honestly, mister, I wouldn't recommend it. It's strange out there. Not a proper house. More like a burrow. And the isolation. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. If you're looking for a place to settle, there are better options. What better options can I get for $20? Emmett had asked plainly. The clerk had no answer for that. An hour later, Emmett had paid out 20 of his remaining $23 and held in his hand a deed to property he'd never seen, described only as natural cave dwelling with improvements. Approximately 800 square feet of interior space, located on the east bank of the Green River, 4 miles north of Riverbend. The clerk had drawn him a rough map, warned him one more time about the peculiar nature of the place, and wished him luck with a tone that suggested he thought Emmett would need it. The ride north along the river had taken most of the afternoon. The land here was beautiful in its own austere way. Red and orange rock formations rising from the desert floor, the green ribbon of the river cutting through it all, cottonwood trees clustering along the water's edge. The August heat was fierce, but the river provided relief, and Junebug walked steadily, her small hooves finding purchase on the rocky trail. 4 miles out, just as the clerk had described, Emmett found it. The cave was built, or rather, adapted, into a natural rock formation that jutted out from a cliff face about 30 feet above the river. The rock overhang created a natural shelter, and someone long ago had recognized the potential and done the work to make it habitable. A rough stone wall had been built to close off the front, with a wooden door set into it that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Small windows had been cut into the rock on either side of the door, covered with wooden shutters. A narrow path wound down from the cave entrance to the river below, and there was a small, flat area of ground where someone could keep animals or plant a garden. Emmett sat on his saddle for a long time just looking at it. It was strange, no question about that. Not like any home he'd ever seen. But there was something about it that appealed to him. Maybe the way it seemed to grow, right out of the land itself, as if it had always been there and always would be. The river murmured below, a constant gentle sound. The rock would provide natural insulation against heat and cold. It was remote, yes, but that didn't bother him. He'd spent most of his life alone anyway. He dismounted, tied Junebug to a cottonwood tree, and approached the door. It wasn't locked. There was no lock to speak of, just a simple latch. He lifted it and pushed the door open, hinges squealing in protest. The interior was dark and cool, and he waited a moment for his eyes to adjust. The front chamber was larger than he'd expected, maybe 20 feet across and 15 deep, with a ceiling that rose to about 8 feet at its highest point. The floor had been smoothed and leveled, covered in places with flat stones fitted together. There was a simple fireplace built against one wall, its chimney disappearing up through a natural crack in the rock above. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the fireplace. A sleeping platform had been built along the far wall, just a frame with rope supports where a mattress would go. Shelves had been carved directly into the rock walls, and there were iron hooks driven into the stone for hanging things. It was crude, certainly, but it was also carefully made by someone who had understood how to work with stone and wood and make a space livable. Emmett stepped inside, and the temperature dropped immediately. The rock held the coolness like a blessing after the desert heat. His boots scraped on the stone floor as he moved around the space, running his hand along the walls, testing the stability of the furniture, peering up the chimney to make sure it was clear. Everything was dusty and covered in cobwebs, abandoned for years, but nothing was broken beyond repair. The structure itself was sound. The rock walls were solid. The roof was the natural stone of the cliff itself, no leaks to worry about. The door would need to be rehung properly and the shutters repaired, but those were simple tasks. At the back of the main chamber, he noticed a narrow passage leading deeper into the rock. It was dark back there, too dark to see much without a light, but the opening was there, suggesting the cave extended farther than just this one room. He'd explore that later. For now, he stood in the middle of his new home, if you could call it that, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Maybe just the absence of the constant low-level anxiety that had been his companion for the past 3 months. He had a roof over his head. He had water close by. He had $3 left for supplies. And he had a place where no one would bother him, where he could live out whatever time he had left in peace. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had yesterday. He went back outside, untied Junebug, and led her down to the river to drink. She waded in up to her knees, the cool water flowing around her legs, and drank deeply while Emmett knelt beside her and splashed water on his face and neck. The sun was beginning to set, painting the rock formations in shades of orange and gold. That night, he slept on the stone sleeping platform, with his bedroll spread out beneath him, too tired to care about comfort. Junebug stood just outside the door, dozing on her feet. The sound of the river was a constant presence, and through the crooked door, Emmett could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He'd come here to disappear, to fade away quietly in a place where no one would notice or care. He'd bought this strange cave house because it was all he could afford, and because it offered shelter and solitude. He had no idea yet what he'd really purchased. He had no idea that inside these stone walls, hidden in the darkness of the deeper chambers, lay a story that would change everything. But he'd find out soon enough. 3 days passed in the simple rhythm of survival and basic maintenance. Emmett swept out the accumulated dust and debris from years of abandonment, cleared the cobwebs from the corners, and scrubbed the stone floor with river water until it showed its natural color again. He repaired the door hinges with wire and a bit of patience, and patched the shutters well enough to keep out the wind. He gathered driftwood from along the riverbank and stacked it near the fireplace. He caught fish from the river, trout that fought hard and tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. The cave began to feel less like a curiosity and more like a home. But he'd been avoiding the narrow passage at the back of the main chamber. It made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite name. The opening was only about 3 feet wide and maybe 5 feet tall, requiring a person to duck and move carefully to enter. In the dim light from the fireplace, it looked like a mouth leading into absolute darkness, and Emmett had no particular desire to explore it on the 4th morning. However, as he sat drinking coffee made from the last of his grounds, he felt a draught of cool air move across his face. It came from the back passage, carrying with it a smell that was different from the main chamber, drier, older, like stone that had been untouched for a very long time. His curiosity finally overcame his reluctance. He fashioned a torch from a piece of driftwood and some cloth soaked in a bit of the lamp oil he'd bought in town, lit it from the fireplace, and approached the passage. Ducking his head, he moved through the narrow opening and found himself in a space that immediately opened up into something much larger. The second chamber was remarkable. It was bigger than the main room, maybe 30 feet across and 20 deep, with a ceiling that soared up into darkness beyond the reach of his torchlight. But what struck him immediately was the clear evidence of deliberate, careful work. This wasn't just a natural cave that someone had stumbled upon and used. This was a space that had been shaped, carved, expanded with great skill and enormous effort. The walls showed the marks of tools, chisel work, precise and methodical. Stone shelves had been carved directly into the walls at regular intervals, creating storage spaces that were level and sturdy. The floor had been smoothed and flattened, though it retained more of its natural stone texture than the main chamber. Along one wall, a series of small niches had been cut into the rock, each about the size of a large book. Emmett moved slowly through the space, holding his torch high, trying to understand what he was seeing. Someone had spent months, maybe years, working this stone. This wasn't the hasty work of someone seeking temporary shelter. This was the work of someone who intended to stay, who had vision and skill and determination. As he moved along the far wall, running his hand over the smooth stone, his fingers found something carved into the rock face. He brought the torch closer and saw letters, painstakingly chiseled into the hard surface, J.F. 1853 below that. Another inscription, "A man must build his own freedom." Emmett stood there for a long moment, reading those words over and over. Who was J.F.? What had he meant by building his own freedom? And why carve it into stone unless you wanted it to last forever? He continued his exploration, moving methodically around the chamber, and found more inscriptions. Dates 1853, 1854, 1855, small marks that might have been counting days or tracking time. And then, carved near one of the stone shelves, a longer inscription, "Let this place be sanctuary for those who have none." The words sent a strange feeling through Emmett's chest, something between sadness and recognition. Whoever J.F. had been, he'd understood what it meant to need sanctuary. He'd understood it deeply enough to carve it into stone. Emmett was about to turn back when his torch illuminated something he'd almost missed. A section of wall where one stone sat slightly proud of the others, its edges just barely different from the surrounding rock. It was cunningly done, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, but once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He set the torch in a crack in the rock where it would stay upright, then worked his fingers around the edges of that stone. It was wedged tight, but after several minutes of careful pressure it shifted. He worked it back and forth gently until finally it came free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside the hollow was a wooden box. It was small, maybe a foot long and 8 inches wide, made of dark wood that had aged well in the dry cave air. The lid was fitted tight, and there was no lock, just a simple wooden peg holding it closed. Emmett lifted it out carefully, it had some weight to it, and carried it back to the main chamber where the morning light would let him see better. He sat at the table, the box in front of him, and hesitated. This felt like opening something private, like reading someone's diary without permission. But JF, whoever he was, had been gone for many years. The cave had been abandoned, sold for taxes, and now it belonged to Emmett. If there were secrets here, they were his to know now. He pulled the wooden peg free and lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were papers. Letters, he realized, written in a clear, careful hand on paper that had yellowed with age but remained intact. Beneath the letters were sketches, drawings done in pencil or charcoal on rough paper. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, was a small tintype photograph in a simple frame. Emmett's hands shook slightly as he lifted out the first letter. The paper was brittle, and he unfolded it with great care. The ink was faded but still legible. He began to read. "My name is Joshua Freeman. I was born a slave in Missouri in the year 1820. I write these words in the year of our Lord 1853, in the house I have built with my own hands in the stone of this mountain. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I hoped someone would find." Emmett stopped, his breath catching in his throat. A slave. This place had been built by a runaway slave. He continued reading. "I escaped from bondage in the spring of 1851. My master was a cruel man, and my life was not my own. I had a wife, Sarah, and 2 children, Thomas and Mary. I have not seen them since the night I ran. I pray to God they are safe, though I know the likelihood is that they have been sold away or punished for my sin of wanting freedom. I ran west because west was a way. I worked where I could, learned what I could. In a town in Missouri, I met a stonemason who took pity on me and taught me his trade. I learned to shape rock, to see the structure hidden inside the stone, to make from hard earth something that could shelter life. When I came to this place beside the river, I knew it was where I had to stop. I saw this cave and understood what it could be, a sanctuary, a place where no man could be owned, where the very walls would protect those who needed protecting. I have been here 2 years now, working in the coolness of the stone, shaping it into something more. I'm alone here, but I am free. That is worth more than I can say." Emmett set down the first letter and picked up another. This one was dated 1854 and was shorter. The work continues. "I have finished the main chamber and begun the second. My hands are scarred from the tools, and my back aches at night. But the stone yields to patience. I imagine my Sarah seeing this place, imagine my children playing by the river. Perhaps one day I will be brave enough to go back for them. Perhaps one day this house in the stone will shelter my family." There were more letters, each one dated, each one revealing more of Joshua Freeman's story. He wrote about the loneliness, the fear that slave catchers would find him, the back-breaking work of carving habitable space from solid rock. He wrote about his faith in God, his hope for freedom, his determination to create something lasting. The sketches showed his plans, architectural drawings of how the cave could be expanded, where additional chambers could be carved, how the space could eventually house multiple families. His vision was ambitious, thoughtful, and born of someone who understood what it meant to need shelter from a hostile world. The final letter was dated March 1855. "I have made my decision. I will go back for my family. I have been free for 4 years while they remain in chains, and I can no longer live with that knowledge. This house in the stone is strong now, and there is room for them here. We could live in safety, away from those who would see us return to bondage. I go tomorrow. If God wills it, I will return with my Sarah, my Thomas, my Mary. If I do not return, then let whoever finds this place know what it was meant to be. Let it be sanctuary for those who have none. Let it shelter the broken and give refuge to the weary. If I don't come back, finish what I started, please. Don't let this be for nothing. Joshua Freeman, March 15th, 1855. Emmett's eyes were wet. He set the letter down and picked up the tintype photograph with trembling hands. The image was faded and spotted with age, but he could make out the figure of a black man, powerfully built, with strong features and eyes that looked directly at the camera, with a mixture of dignity and deep sadness. This was Joshua Freeman. Emmett sat at that table for a long time, the letters spread before him, the photograph held in his weathered hands. He thought about a man who had carved freedom out of stone, who had shaped sanctuary with his own scarred hands, who had been willing to risk everything to save his family. He thought about courage and hope, and the desperate lengths people go to when they want nothing more than to be free. The cave wasn't cursed, he realized. It was blessed. It was sacred in a way that had nothing to do with churches or prayers. It was a place where a man had literally built his own freedom, one chisel strike at a time, alone in the dark stone, driven by love and determination, and now it belonged to Emmett. He looked around the main chamber with new eyes, seeing the work differently now. Every stone in that fireplace had been placed by Joshua's hands. Every shelf had been carved by his skill. Every smooth surface represented hours of patient labor, driven by hope for a better future. Emmett felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Not heavy, but present. He'd thought he was buying a place to hide away and die quietly. Instead, he'd inherited a legacy. He carefully gathered the letters, the sketches, and the photograph, returned them to the wooden box, and closed the lid. He would read them again many times. He would study Joshua's sketches and understand his vision. And he would make a decision about what to do with this knowledge, with this place, with this inheritance he never asked for. But already, sitting there in the cool stone chamber, with the river murmuring below, and the morning light slanting through the repaired shutters, Emmett Granger knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't just live here. He had to continue what Joshua Freeman had started. He just didn't know yet what that meant. For the next week, Emmett lived inside Joshua Freeman's words. He read the letters over and over until he could recite passages from memory. He studied the sketches, tracing his fingers over the careful lines that showed where walls could be extended, where additional chambers could be carved, where this place could become something more than just a hiding place. Joshua had been born in bondage, but he wrote with the clear hand of an educated man. He must have taught himself, or been taught by someone brave enough to break the laws that kept knowledge from enslaved people. His words were thoughtful, measured, deeply felt. He wrote about theology and philosophy, about the nature of freedom and the weight of chains, both visible and invisible. He wrote about missing his family with an ache that leapt off the page even 30 years later. One passage in particular stayed with Emmett. Read late one night by firelight, a man who has never been free cannot understand what I have gained here. A man who has always been free cannot understand what I have lost. I live between two worlds, free in body but enslaved still by memory and separation. Perhaps true freedom only comes when those we love are also free. Until then, I am only half a man, living half a life. Emmett understood that kind of living. He'd spent decades drifting from place to place, never putting down roots, never allowing himself to care too deeply about anything that couldn't be packed on a horse and carried away. He'd told himself it was freedom, but maybe it had just been running. Maybe Joshua had understood something that Emmett was only beginning to grasp, that freedom without purpose was just another kind of emptiness. On the 8th day, Emmett made a decision. He went to the back chamber and unwrapped the cloth from around Joshua's tools. They were still there, carefully stored, waiting for hands that never returned to use them. There were chisels of various sizes, a mallet with a worn handle, files for shaping stone, measuring tools carved from wood. Everything a stonemason would need. Emmett had never worked stone before, but he knew his way around tools. He'd built fences, repaired buildings, done all manner of ranch work over the years. He could learn this. He started small, following Joshua's sketches, working on improving the ventilation in the back chamber by carefully widening one of the natural cracks that led to the surface. The work was slow and painstaking. Stone didn't yield easily, and every strike of the chisel had to be placed with thought and care. His hands blistered, then calloused over. His shoulders and back protested the unfamiliar movements, but something about the work felt right. There was a meditation to it, a rhythm that emerged after the first painful hours. Strike, pause, assess. Strike, pause, assess. The stone revealed itself slowly, teaching patience to anyone willing to learn. He worked in the mornings when the light was good, spent the afternoons fishing or tending to Junebug, and returned to the cave in the evenings to read more of Joshua's letters. His existence contracted to this small space: the cave, the river, the work, the words. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt like the first time in his adult life that he was genuinely present somewhere, truly inhabiting a place rather than just passing through it. 2 weeks after discovering the letters, Emmett had his first visitor. He was working in the front area, repairing one of the window shutters, when he heard the sound of someone approaching. He looked up to see an old man standing at the edge of the flat ground near the cave entrance, watching him with dark, patient eyes. The man was Ute, Emmett realized. Though age had weathered him beyond easy identification, he might have been 70 or 80, his long white hair pulled back and tied, his face a map of lines and weathered skin. He wore a mixture of traditional and modern clothing: deerskin leggings, a worn cotton shirt, beaded moccasins. He carried a walking stick carved from juniper, but he stood straight despite his age, and his eyes were sharp. Emmett set down his tools and stood slowly, showing his empty hands. "Good morning," he said. The old man nodded but said nothing, continuing to study Emmett with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile, just deeply observant. "I'm Emmett Granger," he offered. "I bought this place a few weeks back. Just trying to fix it up a bit." The old man's eyes moved from Emmett to the cave entrance, to Junebug grazing nearby, then back to Emmett. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravelly but clear, his English perfect though accented with something older. "I know this place," he said. "My grandfather told me about it. The Freedom Cave, he called it, where the black stone carver lived long ago." Emmett felt his heart quicken. "You knew him?" "Joshua Freeman? I was a boy. I saw him sometimes working here. My people," he gestured vaguely to the north, "we understood what he was doing. We understood running, hiding, making a home where others could not reach you. We did not speak to him often. He wanted to be left alone. But we knew he was here, and we knew why. What happened to him?" Emmett asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. The old man was quiet for a moment, leaning on his walking stick. "One day he left. Walked away with a pack on his back, heading east. We heard later from traders. White men caught him in Missouri, trying to free his family. Killed him or he died in their hands. The stories differ. But he never came back. The cave was empty after that. People stayed away. They said his spirit was sad here, waiting for family that would never come." Emmett nodded slowly, feeling the weight of confirmation. Joshua had gone back for his family and died trying. The sanctuary he'd built with such hope and skill had stood empty all these years, waiting. "He left letters," Emmett said quietly. "Inside, in the back chamber. He wrote about what this place was supposed to be. A sanctuary. A place where people who needed refuge could find it." The old man's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval. "Then you know the truth of this place. It is not cursed. It is blessed by the work of a free man, by the hope of a father." He paused, then asked, "What will you do with it?" Emmett looked at the cave entrance, at the solid stone, and the careful work that had gone into making it habitable. "I don't rightly know yet," he admitted, "but I can't just live here and let it go to waste. Joshua Freeman built this for a reason. He wanted it to matter." The old man nodded. "Then perhaps you are the right person to have found it. My grandfather used to say that places choose their keepers as much as keepers choose places." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "My name is Nakoa. If you honor what was built here, you will have no trouble from my people. We remember those who create sanctuary." He walked away, moving with surprising steadiness for a man of his age, disappearing into the sage and rock as if he'd never been there. Emmett stood for a long time after he'd gone, thinking about what Nakoa had said. Places choose their keepers. Was that what had happened? Had this cave, this strange hollow in the stone built by a man seeking freedom, somehow chosen him? An old cowboy with nothing left but a donkey and a worn saddle and $3 silver? It seemed impossible, but then again, so did everything else about his current situation. He went back inside, to the box where he kept Joshua's letters, and found the one with the passage he'd been thinking about for days. If I don't come back, finish what I started. Please, don't let this be for nothing. Emmett read those words again, feeling their weight, understanding finally what they meant. Joshua Freeman had died trying to save his family, but his dream, his work, his sanctuary, those could still live. Those could still serve the purpose he'd intended. Not for his family, since they'd never come, but for others, for people who needed what Joshua had needed, what Emmett himself had needed. A place where you could be safe, where you could be free, where no one could reach you to tell you that you didn't matter or weren't wanted. Emmett folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. Then he picked up Joshua's chisel, worn smooth by the hands of a man who'd known what it meant to be owned, and went back to work. He would finish what Joshua started. He would make this place matter. He just had to figure out how. 6 weeks passed in steady, purposeful work. Emmett fell into a rhythm that felt more satisfying than anything he'd done in years. He rose with the sun, worked on the cave until the afternoon heat drove him to the river, spent his evenings fishing or making repairs to the simpler wooden elements of his home. His hands grew harder, his back grew stronger despite his age, and the cave slowly transformed from an abandoned curiosity into something approaching Joshua Freeman's vision. He'd cleared and expanded the back chamber, following the sketches, learning through trial and error how to read stone and work with its grain. He'd built proper storage shelves from driftwood he collected along the river. He'd created a small garden plot in the flat area outside, planting seeds he'd bought in town with his dwindling money. Beans, squash, a few vegetables that might survive the harsh conditions. The work was good for him. He felt purpose returning to his bones, replacing the hollowness that had been growing there for years. He talked to Junebug as he worked, and sometimes, when the light was right, he felt like he could almost sense Joshua Freeman in the stone around him, approving of the progress, grateful that someone had finally come to continue what he'd started. Emmett's last $2 went to cornmeal and coffee in town. He was surviving now mostly on fish from the river and the occasional rabbit he could snare. It was lean living, but he'd known worse. As long as he had the river and the cave, he'd be all right. He was working in the garden one afternoon, in late September, when he heard the sound of someone stumbling down the trail from the north. He looked up to see a young man, maybe 25 years old, half running and half falling down the rocky slope. The man was Mexican, dark-haired and desperate-looking, with blood on his shirt and fear in his eyes. Emmett stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to where he'd have worn a gun if he still owned one. But the young man wasn't a threat. He was clearly running from something, not toward trouble. The man saw Emmett and froze, breathing hard, ready to bolt in another direction if necessary. They stared at each other for a long moment across 30 feet of rocky ground. "Please," the young man finally said in heavily accented English. "Please, I need help." "They are coming. They will kill me." Emmett glanced past him up the trail but saw no one yet. He made a quick decision. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the cave. "Quickly." The young man didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled forward, nearly falling, and Emmett caught his arm and helped him toward the cave entrance. Up close, Emmett could see that the blood on his shirt came from a wound in his side, not deep, but bleeding steadily. They got inside, and Emmett sat him down on one of the chairs, then went to close and latch the door. "Who's after you?" he asked. "Men from town. They say I stole horses." "I did not. I work for a ranch, breaking horses. But the owner's son, he does not like me, so he tells lies. Says I am a thief. They want to hang me." The young man's voice shook with exhaustion and terror. Emmett knew that story. He'd seen it before, Mexican workers blamed for crimes they didn't commit, scapegoated because they were easier targets than the real culprits. Justice wasn't always just, especially for people without power or protection. "What's your name?" Emmett asked. "Miguel. Miguel Reyes." "All right, Miguel. Let me see that wound." He helped Miguel remove his shirt and examined the injury. It was a knife cut, shallow but long, across his ribs. Someone had tried to stick him, but he'd moved fast enough to turn a killing blow into a flesh wound. Emmett cleaned it with water from the river, then wrapped it with strips torn from an old shirt. "It would heal, given time and rest. You need to stay quiet," Emmett said. "If anyone comes, I'll tell them I haven't seen you. There's a back chamber deeper in. You can hide there if you need to. Why do you help me?" Miguel asked, searching Emmett's face. "You do not know me. I could be a thief, like they say." Emmett thought about that for a moment, then said, "This place was built by a man who knew what it was like to run. He meant it to be sanctuary. I reckon I ought to honor that. Besides, I've seen enough false accusations in my time to know them when I hear them." He showed Miguel the back chamber, the carved walls, and briefly told him about Joshua Freeman. Miguel listened with wide eyes, looking around at the careful stonework with new understanding. He was a slave. Miguel asked quietly. He was. Built all this by himself, hoping to bring his family here where they'd be safe. Never got the chance. "And now you continue his work," Miguel said. "It wasn't a question. Trying to," Emmett replied. For the next week, Miguel stayed hidden in the cave. True enough, on the second day, 3 men came riding up the trail asking if Emmett had seen a Mexican man running through. Emmett, standing at his cave entrance with his arms crossed, said he'd seen no one and suggested they look elsewhere. They didn't push it. An old man living in a cave wasn't worth the trouble of searching, and they rode off. As Miguel healed, he helped Emmett with the work. He was good with his hands, skilled in ways Emmett wasn't. Together, they reinforced some of the wooden structures, improved the door, and made progress on expanding the living space. Miguel was amazed by Joshua's tools and sketches. He was an artist, Miguel said one evening, studying the drawings by firelight. Not just a builder, an artist of stone and hope. "I think you're right," Emmett agreed. They talked in the evenings, sharing stories. Miguel told him about his family in Sonora, about his dreams of saving enough money to buy a small piece of land, about the casual cruelty he faced as a Mexican worker in American territory. Emmett told him about his years on the trail, about Junebug, about arriving at this cave with $20 and no plan beyond survival. "You found purpose here," Miguel observed. "In this place of another man's sorrow, you found your own purpose." Those words stayed with Emmett long after Miguel spoke them. On the 8th day, Miguel's wound had healed enough for him to travel safely. The men who'd been hunting him had moved on, and the immediate danger had passed. He needed to keep moving west, find work somewhere far enough away that the rumors wouldn't follow him. Before he left, Miguel carved something into the wall of the back chamber near Joshua Freeman's inscriptions. Emmett watched as he carefully etched MR 1886 for the keeper of sanctuary. "So others will know," Miguel said, "that this place still serves its purpose, that Joshua Freeman's dream did not die with him." They clasped hands at the cave entrance in the early morning light. Miguel had tears in his eyes. "You saved my life, senor. I will not forget this place or what it means. If I can ever help another as you helped me, I will." Emmett watched him walk south along the river trail until he disappeared around a bend in the canyon. Then he went back inside and stood looking at the new inscription on the wall, next to Joshua's words. 2 men now. 2 stories of people seeking freedom, seeking safety, finding it in this hollow carved from stone by determination and hope. Emmett understood now what he hadn't fully grasped when he'd first discovered Joshua's letters. This wasn't just about honoring one man's legacy. It was about creating something ongoing, something living. Joshua had started it, but it didn't have to end with him. It could continue, could grow, could keep serving the purpose it was meant for. He picked up the wooden box where he kept Joshua's letters and found the small handmade cross he'd discovered tucked in the bottom, carved from cottonwood. Joshua had made it, probably in the long evenings when he sat alone. hoping for a future that never came. Emmett hung the cross on the wall of the main chamber, where it would catch the morning light through the repaired shutters. It wasn't about religion exactly. It was about faith, faith that hope matters, that helping others matters, that one person's compassion can ripple outward in ways we never see. Miguel was safe now. He'd go on to live his life, probably never knowing that he'd been the first person to truly test whether Joshua Freeman's sanctuary could still function as intended. But Emmett knew, and that knowledge changed everything. He was no longer just an old cowboy hiding from the world in a strange cave house. He was a keeper of sanctuary, a guardian of a place that mattered. He'd come here to disappear. Instead, he'd found a reason to be visible, to be present, to be useful in a way he'd never imagined possible. The cave had chosen its keeper, just as Nakoa had said, and the keeper had chosen to honor what the cave was meant to be. He just didn't know yet how many more people would come seeking what Joshua Freeman had built all those years ago, alone in the stone, carving freedom with his own scarred hands. October brought cooler air and the first hint of the coming winter. The cottonwoods along the river turned gold, their leaves rustling in the constant breeze. Emmett's garden had produced a modest harvest, enough squash and beans to supplement his diet and put away some dried stores for the cold months ahead. He was leaner than he'd been in years, but stronger too. The work and the purpose had given him a vitality he'd thought lost to age. 3 months had passed since he'd bought the cave for $20. 3 months since he'd discovered Joshua Freeman's letters and taken up the work of continuing what had been started. The cave was noticeably improved now, cleaner, more organized, more livable. He'd finished expanding the back chamber and had begun preliminary work on a third room. Following Joshua's sketches, it was during this work, excavating a section where Joshua's drawings indicated a natural hollow could be expanded, that Emmett made an unexpected discovery. He'd removed several stones from what appeared to be a deliberately constructed section of floor, not natural rock, but stones carefully fitted together like a small hearth. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and time, was a small tin container. Emmett's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside, gleaming in the dim light of his lamp, was gold dust, not a fortune, but not nothing either. Maybe $40 or $50 worth, carefully saved over time. And tucked in with the gold was a small piece of paper with a few lines written in Joshua Freeman's hand. For the next keeper, to help others. A man who would use this for himself is not worthy to live here. A man who would use it to continue the work. He is the one this place has been waiting for. Emmett sat back on his heels, staring at the gold, feeling the weight of Joshua's trust extending across 3 decades. This wasn't just money. It was a test and a gift, left by a man who'd understood that his sanctuary might outlive him, might serve others, might need resources to fulfill its purpose. The temptation was real. Emmett had nothing. This gold could buy him comfort, supplies, maybe even a proper bed and some decent clothes. It could ease his final years considerably. He wouldn't have to live on fish and foraged food. He wouldn't have to worry about making it through the winter, but Joshua's words were clear. This wasn't for the keeper's comfort. It was for others, for the work, for continuing what had been started. Emmett carefully wrapped the gold back in its oilcloth and placed it in the wooden box with Joshua's letters. He would use it only when it was needed for the purpose intended. He would honor Joshua's trust, even if it meant continuing to live lean and simple. That decision was tested sooner than he expected. 2 days later, in the late afternoon, Emmett heard the sound of a wagon struggling down the rocky trail. He went outside to see a tired horse pulling a weather-beaten farm wagon. Driving it was a woman in her 30s, thin and exhausted-looking. With 2 small children visible in the wagon bed behind her, the wagon made it halfway down the slope before one of the wheels caught in a rut and the whole thing lurched to a stop. Emmett heard the sound of wood cracking, the axle or the wheel. Something critical had broken. The woman sat for a moment, her shoulders slumping in defeat. then climbed down and stood looking at the damage with the expression of someone for whom this was simply the last in a long series of disasters. Emmett walked up the trail to meet her. Up close, he could see she'd been crying, and her dress was patched and worn. The children, a boy of maybe 7 and a girl of 5, watched from the wagon with wide, frightened eyes. "Ma'am," Emmett said, removing his hat, "looks like you've had some trouble." "The axles broke," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "I can't fix it. I don't have tools, and I don't have money to pay for repairs. I don't have much of anything except 2 hungry children and about 30 miles left to go before we reach my brother's place." She looked at him with eyes that had given up on expecting help. "I don't suppose you have tools I could borrow, or know someone who does." "I can take a look," Emmett said. "And I've got food if your young ones are hungry. Why don't you come down to the cave and rest a bit while I see what I can do?" The woman, her name was Sarah, she told him, hesitated, clearly torn between desperation and the lifetime of caution women learn about trusting strange men. But the children were hungry, and she was out of options. Emmett got them settled in the main chamber. He made a simple stew from dried beans and some of his garden vegetables, and the children ate like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. While they ate, Sarah told him her story. Her husband had died 6 months ago in a farming accident in Kansas. Without his labor, she couldn't maintain the farm. The bank had foreclosed, and she'd been forced to leave with whatever she could fit in the wagon. Her brother had a homestead in Nevada and had written that she and the children could come live there, but the journey had been harder than she'd imagined. Money ran out. The wagon was falling apart. The horse was nearly done. "I feel like I'm dragging my children toward disaster instead of safety," she said quietly, trying not to cry in front of them. "Every day something goes wrong. Every day I wonder if we'll make it." Emmett listened, hearing Joshua Freeman's voice in her words. People running toward freedom, toward safety, toward the hope of a better life. People who needed help, who needed sanctuary, even if just for a moment. He went to examine the wagon. The axle was indeed cracked, and one wheel was badly damaged. It could be repaired with proper materials, but it would take most of a day's work, and wood he didn't have. He'd need to go into town, buy supplies, do the repairs. That night, after Sarah and her children were asleep in the main chamber, and he'd made himself a bed outside near Junebug, Emmett took out the tin of gold dust and Joshua's note. "A man who would use it to continue the work. He is the one this place has been waiting for." This was the work. This was exactly what Joshua had saved this gold for. The next morning, Emmett rode Junebug into Riverbend. He used some of Joshua's gold to buy what he needed: a new axle, tools for repairs, food supplies for Sarah's journey, grain for her horse. The store owner looked at him curiously, the hermit from the cave suddenly buying goods for someone else, but Emmett offered no explanations. It took him all day to repair the wagon. Sarah watched, silent and disbelieving, while the children played by the river. When it was done and the wagon was sound again, he loaded the supplies he'd bought into the back. "I can't pay you," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I have nothing to give you." "I'm not asking for payment," Emmett replied. "You're going to your brother's place. You're trying to build a life for your children. That's enough." He told her then about Joshua Freeman, about the slave who'd built this sanctuary, hoping to bring his family to safety, about the gold he'd left specifically to help others. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face. "Places like this," she whispered, "places like this give people hope. Not just shelter or food or help with a wagon. Hope that somewhere somebody still cares. That the world isn't entirely cruel." They left the next morning, the wagon repaired and supplied, the children waving goodbye as they rolled up the trail. Sarah had looked back at the cave one last time, and Emmett thought he saw her lips move in a prayer or blessing. After they were gone, he stood in the empty cave, feeling the strange mix of fullness and emptiness that comes from helping someone move on. He'd used a good portion of Joshua's gold, but he knew it had been used exactly as intended. He added a note to his own journal, which he'd started keeping. Sarah and her children, wagon repair, food for journey, safe passage to Nevada. One day, he thought, if anyone ever found these records, they would know that Joshua Freeman's dream hadn't died. It had continued. It was still saving people, still offering sanctuary to those who needed it most. The tin of gold was lighter now, but his heart felt heavier in a good way. He understood more deeply what he'd taken on when he'd decided to honor Joshua's legacy. This would cost him. Not just money, but energy, time, resources he could barely spare. He'd have to live even simpler than before to make this sustainable. But as he stood looking at the carved words on the wall, "Let this place be sanctuary for those who have none," he knew there was no other choice. Some things were worth more than personal comfort. Some purposes were worth the sacrifice. He'd come to this cave as a man with nothing, looking for a place to disappear. He'd become the keeper of something that mattered, a guardian of hope carved into stone by a man who'd understood what it meant to need freedom. And he was starting to understand that this role, this purpose, was the most valuable thing he'd ever possessed. November came with cold winds and the first dusting of snow on the higher peaks surrounding the canyon. Emmett prepared for winter with the thoroughness of a man who'd lived through many harsh seasons. He gathered more firewood than he thought he'd need, stocked dried fish and preserved vegetables, and made sure Junebug had adequate shelter in a lean-to he'd built against the rock face. He'd started keeping a journal, using paper he'd bought in town with the last of his own money. It seemed important to document what was happening here, to continue Joshua Freeman's practice of recording the cave's purpose and the people it served. His handwriting was rougher than Joshua's, but the intent was the same: to bear witness, to create a record, to make sure this work was remembered. The journal sat on the table each evening, and by lamplight he would write about the day's work, about the improvements to the cave, about his thoughts and reflections. He was no scholar like Joshua seemed to have been, but he wrote plainly and honestly, and sometimes that was enough. The fourth visitor came on a grey afternoon when the temperature had dropped below freezing. Emmett was inside tending the fire when he heard a soft sound outside, not footsteps exactly, more like the shuffle of someone too weak to walk properly. He opened the door to find an elderly Chinese man collapsed just outside the entrance. He was skeletal thin, his clothes in rags, his face bruised and swollen. One of his legs was badly injured, the ankle twisted at an angle that made Emmett wince. The man looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, only the dull acceptance of someone who'd given up expecting mercy from the world. Emmett didn't hesitate. He lifted the man, frighteningly light, nothing but bones and determination, and carried him inside. He laid him on the sleeping platform, covered him with blankets, and began the work of assessment and care. The ankle was broken or badly sprained, and there were signs of beating, bruises across his ribs, cuts on his face and arms. Emmett had seen this before too. Chinese railroad workers were often treated worse than animals, worked until they dropped, abandoned when they were injured or sick. The man tried to speak, but it was clear they shared no common language. His words were soft and rhythmic, incomprehensible to Emmett, but the meaning in his eyes was universal: fear, pain, gratitude for shelter. Emmett made signs indicating food and rest, and the man nodded his understanding. Over the next days, Emmett nursed him with the simple remedies he knew: clean water, warm food, rest, and time. He wrapped the injured ankle as best he could, fashioned a crutch from a branch, kept the fire burning against the cold. The man, who through gestures indicated his name, sounded something like Lao, began to recover slowly. He was perhaps 70 years old, though hardship made age difficult to determine. As his strength returned, something remarkable emerged. Despite the language barrier, Lao and Emmett found ways to communicate. Lao had skills. He watched Emmett working with Joshua's stone tools one day and made gestures, asking to see them. When Emmett handed him a chisel, Lao examined it with the eye of someone who understood craft. Then, despite his injury, he hobbled to the back chamber and began demonstrating techniques for shaping stone that Emmett had never imagined. He showed Emmett how to read the grain of the rock, Where to place the chisel for maximum effect with minimum effort. How to create smooth curves instead of rough edges. His hands, gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, moved with precision and grace when they held tools. They worked together in comfortable silence, old men who'd learned that words weren't always necessary for understanding. Lau would point, demonstrate, adjust Emmett's grip or stance, nod approval when Emmett got it right. In 2 weeks, Emmett learned more about stonework than he'd figured out in 3 months of trial and error. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, Lau saw Joshua Freeman's tintype photograph sitting on the shelf. He pointed at it questioningly, and Emmett told him the story as simply as he could, using gestures and expressions to convey what words couldn't. Lau listened, his dark eyes never leaving Emmett's face. When the story was finished, he nodded slowly, deeply. Then he touched his own chest and made gestures that Emmett understood. He too had known slavery, had known running, had known what it meant to build something from nothing, with your own scarred hands. In the railroad camps, Lau conveyed through signs and expressions, Chinese workers were treated as less than human, worked until they died, beaten if they complained, abandoned when they were no longer useful. He'd been left to die when his ankle was injured, but he'd crawled away, following the river, looking for anything that might offer shelter, and he'd found Joshua Freeman's sanctuary, just as Joshua had hoped someone would, before Lau left, 2 weeks after his arrival. His ankle healed enough for careful travel. He did something that moved Emmett deeply. He spent a full day carving a small stone, working it with the patient skill of a master craftsman. When he finished, he placed it on the shelf near Joshua's tintype. It was a simple thing, smooth and round, with Chinese characters carved into its face. Lau made gestures indicating blessing, protection, peace. Then he touched the stone, touched his heart, and pointed to the cave itself. A blessing for the sanctuary, a gift from one craftsman to the memory of another who'd worked this same stone decades before. Emmett walked with him to the edge of the property as he left, moving slowly but steadily south. Lau turned back once, pressed his palms together and bowed, and Emmett returned the gesture as best he knew how. The cave felt emptier after he left, but also fuller somehow. The blessed stone sat on the shelf, next to Joshua's photograph and Miguel's inscription on the wall. The sanctuary was accumulating history, collecting the marks of people who'd passed through seeking safety and found it. A week after Lau departed, the 5th visitor arrived. This time, it was a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, riding a worn-out horse and looking over her shoulder with the terror of someone being hunted. She nearly rode past the cave entirely before Junebug's braying caught her attention, and she saw Emmett standing at the entrance. She pulled up sharply, clearly torn between the need for help and the fear of trusting a stranger. "I'm running from a marriage," she blurted out before Emmett could speak. "My father arranged it. The man is twice my age and cruel. I said no. He said I had no choice. So I stole his horse and left." Emmett saw the determination in her eyes. This was no impulsive flight. This was calculated escape, born of desperation. He also saw the intelligence there, the education that showed in her posture and speech. "You're safe here," he told her. "Come in, rest, figure out your next step." Her name was Margaret, and her story was one Emmett had heard variations of before, a woman treated as property, with no say in her own life, forced to choose between submission and rebellion. She'd chosen rebellion, and now she was paying the price in fear and uncertainty. She stayed 3 days, helping Emmett with the daily work, asking questions about Joshua Freeman's story. She was fascinated by the cave, by its history, by the idea that someone had literally carved freedom from stone. He built this because he understood that sometimes the world doesn't give you freedom, she said on her final evening. "Sometimes you have to make your own. That's what I'm doing. I'm building my own freedom." Emmett used more of Joshua's gold to give her supplies and a small stake for her journey west. She wanted to reach California, find work as a teacher in one of the growing towns there. She had education, skills, and determination. What she needed was a chance. "You're giving me that chance," she said. This place, what you're doing here, it's giving people like me a chance we wouldn't have otherwise. After she rode away, Emmett sat at his table and wrote in his journal, Margaret, fleeing arranged marriage, supplied for journey to California to teach. Smart girl. She'll make something of herself if the world gives her room to do it. Below that, he added, 5 people now. Miguel, Sarah and her children, Lau, Margaret. Joshua saved 5. Not his family, but 5 other souls who needed what he built. Is that what he would have wanted? I think so. I have to think so. Word was spreading slowly but inevitably. In Riverbend and the surrounding small settlements, people were beginning to talk about the hermit by the river who helped folks nobody else would help. Some of the talk was mocking, an old fool throwing away what little he had on drifters and runaways. Some of it was respectful, a good man doing quiet work that mattered. Emmett didn't pay much attention to either kind of talk. He just kept working, kept improving the cave, kept using Joshua's gold when it was needed for someone else's salvation. Winter was fully upon the canyon now. The river ran high and cold, with snowmelt from upstream. The nights were long and frigid. Emmett sat by his fire in the evenings, reading Joshua's letters again, studying the sketches, thinking about what still needed to be done. The back chamber was nearly complete. The third room was taking shape. The cave could house maybe 8 people now if necessary, though it had never held more than 3 at once. But that was the point, wasn't it? Not to fill the place constantly, but to have it ready, to have it available. To make sure that when someone desperate came seeking sanctuary, there was room for them. He thought about his life before the cave, the endless drifting, the purposelessness, the slow fade into irrelevance. He'd been preparing to die, really, not actively but passively accepting that his time was done and his existence no longer mattered. Now he had this. A calling, maybe. A mission. The work of continuing what Joshua Freeman had started, what a man had died trying to complete. It wasn't the life Emmett had imagined for his final years, but it was the life he'd been given, and it meant more than anything he'd ever done before. Outside, Junebug shifted in her shelter, and somewhere distant, a coyote called into the winter night. Emmett added another piece of wood to the fire and opened his journal to write. There would be more visitors. He was certain of that now. As long as the cave stood, as long as someone kept it ready, people would find their way here. And he would be here, the keeper of Joshua Freeman's dream, making sure that sanctuary remained possible for those who had nowhere else to turn. Late November brought Emmett into Riverbend. For winter supplies he couldn't do without. Flour, salt, lamp oil, and a few other necessities. He rode Junebug slowly through the cold morning, his breath visible in the air, thinking about the winter ahead and whether the cave would see any more visitors before spring. The general store was warm compared to the outside, heated by a pot-bellied stove that made the air shimmer. The store owner, Mr. Henderson, had warmed to Emmett over the past months. He'd heard stories about the hermit who helped people, and there was something in his manner now that suggested respect rather than mockery. Emmett was gathering his supplies when something on the wall caught his eye. Henderson had a collection of what he called historical curiosities, old newspapers, faded photographs, wanted posters, and other remnants of the past that he'd collected over the years and displayed in frames on the wall behind the counter. Among them, newly added to the collection, was an old wanted poster. The paper was brown and brittle with age, the ink faded but still readable. Something about it drew Emmett's attention, and he moved closer to examine it. What he saw made his blood turn cold. The poster was dated 1856, issued from St. Louis, Missouri. It offered a reward of $500 for the return of an escaped slave named Joshua Freeman. The description matched. Negro male, approximately 35 years of age, powerfully built, skilled in stonemasonry and carpentry. Distinguishing marks: scar on left forearm, missing small finger on right hand. But it was the crude drawing on the poster that confirmed it beyond any doubt. Despite being rough and poorly done, The face was unmistakably the same one Emmett had stared at in the tintype photograph for months. The strong features, the direct gaze, the set of the jaw, this was Joshua Freeman. Emmett's hands trembled as he stared at the poster. Henderson noticed and came over. "That one's new," the store owner said. "Found it in an estate sale over in Moab last week. Figured it was interesting, you know. Part of the dark history of this country. $500 was a fortune back then for returning a human being to bondage." He shook his head. "Evil times." Emmett forced his voice to remain steady. "Do you know what happened with this man?" Henderson squinted at the poster, then shrugged. "Don't know for certain, but I heard tell from the fellow who sold it to me that this particular man was caught. Tried to go back for his family, can you imagine? Had been free for years, living out west somewhere, but went back to Missouri to free his wife and children. Got caught in the attempt. Died in custody before they could even bring him to trial. They said he fought when they took him, and one of the slave catchers got rough. Man died from the beating, or maybe his heart just gave out. Records say died during apprehension, which usually meant they killed him and didn't want to admit it." The store owner paused, then added, "Shame, really. Man just wanted to free his family. But that's how it was then. People as property. Thank God those days are behind us." Emmett couldn't speak. He stood frozen, staring at the poster, feeling everything he thought he knew about Joshua Freeman's story shift and crystallize into something more tragic and more heroic than he'd imagined. Joshua had made it. He'd found freedom, built his sanctuary, carved his dream from stone, and then he'd given it all up, walked back into the maw of slavery, risked everything because he couldn't live with the knowledge that his family remained in chains. While he was free and it had killed him, the sanctuary had stood empty all these years because the man who built it had loved his family more than his own freedom. He died trying to save them. "You all right?" Henderson asked, noticing Emmett's expression. "I'd like to buy that poster," Emmett said quietly. "Take it off your wall and sell it to me." Henderson looked puzzled. "That old thing? Why would you want it?" "Personal reasons." "How much?" They settled on $2, which left Emmett with barely enough for the supplies he needed. He carefully removed the poster from its frame, rolled it gently, and tucked it into his coat. He couldn't bear the thought of Joshua's face, his story, being displayed as a curiosity on a store wall. It needed to be somewhere it would be honored, not gawked at. The ride back to the cave felt longer than usual. Emmett's mind churned with the new knowledge, reframing everything he'd read in the letters, every inscription on the walls, every careful line in the sketches. Joshua had known, when he wrote that final letter about going back for his family, that he might not return. He'd known the risk, and he'd gone anyway. Love and duty and the unbearable weight of being free while those you loved remained enslaved. It had driven him back into danger and ultimately to his death. When Emmett reached the cave, he spread the poster carefully on the table and sat looking at it for a long time. The reward, the description, the cold, bureaucratic language that reduced a human being to property, to a price, to a problem to be solved. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on the sleeping platform, staring at the stone ceiling that Joshua Freeman had carved with such care and skill, thinking about everything the man had sacrificed. Built a sanctuary for a family that never came, died trying to bring them to safety. In the small hours before dawn, driven by instinct he couldn't name, Emmett lit a lamp and went to the wooden box where he kept Joshua's letters. He'd read them all multiple times, knew them almost by heart. But something nagged at him, a feeling that he'd missed something, that there was more to discover. He took out the tintype photograph in its simple wooden frame, intending to place it next to the wanted poster for comparison. As he lifted it, the frame shifted slightly in his hands, and he heard a soft sound, paper sliding against wood. There was something behind the photograph, with trembling fingers. He carefully pried open the back of the frame. Tucked behind the tintype, folded small and tight, was another letter, one he'd never found before. He unfolded it with the utmost care. The paper was brittle, the ink faded more than the other letters, as if it had been written in haste or with a nearly dry pen. The handwriting was Joshua's, but shakier, more urgent. It was dated March 14th, 1855, the day before the last letter he'd found, the one about going back for his family. "I write this in the knowledge that I may not return. Tomorrow I leave this place that has been my freedom, my sanctuary, my home. I go back to Missouri, back into the darkness I escaped from, because I cannot live another day knowing Sarah suffers in chains, knowing Thomas and Mary are growing up owned by another man, knowing my freedom came at the cost of theirs. I am no hero. I'm a coward who has lived in peace while his family lived in torment. But tomorrow that ends. Tomorrow I either free them or die trying. There is no middle ground left for me. If I succeed, we will return here. This cave will finally become what I built it to be, a home for my family, a sanctuary where we can all be free together. I have seen it in my dreams so many times that it feels more real than the present. If I fail, if I die in the attempt, then let this letter be found by whoever comes next. Let them know that this place was built with love. Let them know it was meant to save families, not just individuals. Let them know I died trying to fulfill the only purpose that ever mattered to me. To whoever finds this, if I don't come back, let this place be what I couldn't finish. Let it save the families I couldn't save. Let it be the sanctuary I meant it to be. Don't let my death mean it stands empty forever. Please, the stone will last longer than any of us. The river will outlive all our troubles. But what we do with the time we have, that's what matters. I built this place because I had to. Because every chisel strike was a prayer that freedom could be carved from stone, that hope could be made solid and real. Finish what I started. Not for me, for every person who will come here desperate and afraid. For everyone who needs to know that somewhere safety still exists. For everyone who has lost everything and needs to believe they can start again. That's all I ask. That's all I've ever asked. Joshua Freeman, March 14th, 1855. Emmett read the letter 3 times, tears running down his weathered cheeks. He sat at the table as the lamp burned low and dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, understanding finally and completely what he'd taken on when he'd decided to continue Joshua's work. This wasn't just about honoring one man's legacy. This wasn't just about providing temporary shelter to people passing through. This was about fulfilling a dream that had died with Joshua Freeman in a Missouri prison or slave market or wherever his final moments had come. The dream that this place could save families, could offer the kind of sanctuary that actually changed lives, not just postponed disasters. Joshua had built this cave hoping to save his own family. When that failed, his dying wish was that it would save other families, other desperate people, other souls seeking freedom from whatever chains bound them. Emmett had been doing that in small ways. Miguel, Sarah, and her children, Lau, Margaret, each had found brief sanctuary here. But was that enough? Was that what Joshua had died hoping for? Or was there something more? Something bigger? He looked around the cave with new eyes, seeing it not as it was, but as it could be. Joshua's sketches showed space for multiple families. The resources, if used wisely, could sustain more than just temporary guests. The location was remote enough to offer real protection for people who needed to disappear for a while, who needed time and space to heal or plan or simply exist without fear. The revelation came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the canyon. He needed to stop thinking of this as a way station and start thinking of it as Joshua had intended, as a genuine sanctuary, a place where people could stay longer than a few days, where families could find actual refuge, not just emergency shelter, where the desperate could rebuild, not just hide. It would require more work, more resources, more sacrifice. It would mean truly dedicating his remaining years to something bigger than his own comfort or survival. But wasn't that exactly what Joshua had asked? Finish what I started. Emmett stood and walked to the back chamber, to the wall where Miguel and Lau had added their marks, where Joshua's inscription still spoke across the decades. He placed his hand flat against the cool stone, feeling the chisel marks beneath his palm, feeling the connection to the man who'd shaped this space with nothing but determination and hope. I understand now, he said quietly to the empty chamber, to the memory of Joshua Freeman, to the future that had to be built. I understand what you're asking, and I'll do it. I'll make this place what you meant it to be. He didn't know yet how. He didn't know if he had the strength, the resources, or the time left to truly fulfill Joshua's vision. But he knew with absolute certainty that he had to try, because Joshua Freeman had died for this dream. The least Emmett could do was live for it. December brought heavy snow to the high country and bitter cold to the canyon. The river still ran, though ice formed along its edges, and the cottonwoods stood bare and skeletal against the grey sky. Emmett worked through the cold with renewed purpose, driven by Joshua Freeman's final letter and the understanding of what this place needed to become. He spent what remained of Joshua's gold and his own savings purchasing lumber, tools, and supplies from town. He sold his saddle, the last thing of value he owned beyond Junebug, to buy materials for expansion. The saddle that had been with him for 23 years, that represented his entire identity as a cowboy, went to a young ranch hand for $12. It felt like cutting off a part of himself, but it also felt right. That life was over. This new life, this work of building sanctuary, required different tools. He studied Joshua's sketches obsessively, understanding now the full scope of the vision. The cave could be expanded to accommodate 3 or 4 families comfortably. There were natural chambers that could be opened up, spaces that could be carved and shaped into living quarters with proper ventilation, storage, and shared common areas. Joshua had planned all of it 30 years ago. Emmett just had to finish what had been started. He worked in the freezing cold, chiseling stone, with hands that ached from the cold and the effort. He built wooden partitions to create separate sleeping areas. He improved the ventilation system, following Joshua's designs to ensure that smoke from the fireplaces would draw properly and fresh air would circulate even in the deepest chambers. He reinforced the entrance, making it more weather-tight against winter winds. The work was exhausting for a man his age, but he felt more alive than he had in decades. This was what purpose felt like. This was what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. The first test of his expanded capacity came on a bitter, cold evening in mid-December. Emmett was inside, tending the fire when he heard voices outside, multiple voices, including children. He opened the door to find a black family huddled together against the cold, a man and woman in their 30s, an elderly grandmother, and 3 children ranging from maybe 4 to 12 years old. They stood in the snow, exhausted and terrified. The father with his arm around his wife protectively. The grandmother with the smallest child clutched to her chest. "Please," the man said, his voice shaking with cold and fear. "We heard there was a place here. A safe place. We're running from Colorado. Night riders burned our farm, threatened to kill us if we didn't leave the territory. We've been traveling for 10 days. The children," his voice broke. "The children can't take much more of this cold." Emmett didn't hesitate. "Come inside, quickly, get warm." They crowded into the main chamber, 6 people suddenly filling the space that had felt so empty moments before. The children were shivering violently, their lips blue with cold. The grandmother looked like she might collapse at any moment. Emmett got them near the fire, wrapped them in what blankets he had, and started heating water for tea and soup. As they warmed, the full story emerged. The father's name was James. His wife was Rebecca. The grandmother was called Mother Ruth. James had owned a small farm, bought and paid for legally, but white neighbors had decided they didn't want black property owners nearby. They'd come one night with torches and threats, given the family one day to leave or be killed. "We left with what we could carry," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. "Everything we built, everything we owned, gone. Just because we dared to own land. The children, Samuel, Grace, and little Mercy, stayed close to their parents, old enough to understand danger even if they didn't fully comprehend the reasons behind it." Emmett looked at these 6 frightened people in his cave and realized with stark clarity his expansion work wasn't nearly finished. The space he'd created was already inadequate. They could stay for the night, maybe a few nights, but then what? The cave couldn't yet accommodate them for the extended period they'd need to recover, plan and prepare for wherever they were going next. That night, with the family sleeping fitfully in the main chamber while he kept watch by the fire, Emmett made his calculations. The second chamber was functional but bare. The third chamber was still half-finished. He needed to work faster, do more, make this place truly capable of housing multiple families for extended periods. 2 days after James and his family arrived, Emmett was confronted with an even bigger challenge. 2 more people showed up. They were Lakota youth, a young man and woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old. They spoke some English, enough to explain that they were fleeing forced relocation to a reservation. Their parents were elderly and sick, being moved to the reservation, but the youth refused to go. They wanted to stay on their ancestral lands, wanted freedom to live as their people had lived. The Indian agents, the young man said, his jaw set with determination. They say we must go to reservation or we will be hunted. We choose to be hunted. We will not live in that place of slow death. Emmett now had 8 people seeking shelter in a space he'd optimistically thought could handle 3 or 4. The cave was crowded, supplies were running low, and the work he'd planned would now have to be done in the presence of frightened families who needed the space while he was trying to expand it. The situation was impossible, and yet there was no choice but to make it work. Over the next 2 weeks, Emmett worked harder than he'd worked in his entire life. He rose before dawn and worked until exhaustion forced him to stop. He taught James and the older Lakota youth how to use the stone tools, showing them the techniques Lau had taught him. Together, they expanded the chambers, carved additional sleeping spaces, improved the storage areas. The women, Rebecca, Mother Ruth, and the young Lakota woman, organized the living space, managed the limited supplies, cooked communal meals that stretched their food as far as possible. The children, after their initial fear subsided, brought unexpected life to the cave. Their laughter echoed off the stone walls, and in quiet moments, Emmett could imagine Joshua Freeman hearing those sounds and knowing his dream had finally come true. But the tensions were real. Different languages, different customs, different fears all pressed together in close quarters. Space was limited, privacy non-existent. The cold was relentless, and food supplies dwindled faster than Emmett could replace them. One evening, as arguments broke out over sleeping arrangements and food portions, Emmett gathered everyone in the main chamber. He told them Joshua Freeman's story, all of it. The escape from slavery, the years of building this sanctuary alone, the dream of bringing his family here, the death while trying to free them. He read aloud from Joshua's final letter, the one that had been hidden behind the photograph. When he finished, there was silence. Then Mother Ruth spoke, her voice heavy with emotion. That man died trying to save his family. We're sitting here in the home he built with his own hands, arguing about blankets and soup, James added quietly. He never got to save the people he loved. We got saved by what he built. That means something. The young Lakota man nodded. In my language we have a word, tiospe. It means extended family, but more than blood. It means people who choose to be family. Maybe that's what this place makes us. Maybe that's what the man who built it would have wanted. From that night, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer just desperate people sharing limited space. They became a makeshift community, working together to improve their shared circumstances. They taught each other skills. James knew carpentry. Rebecca knew herb medicine. The Lakota youth taught tracking and hunting. Mother Ruth had wisdom about making little stretch into much. Emmett became the unofficial leader, not by claiming authority, but by example. He worked the hardest, took the smallest portions, slept on the coldest spot near the entrance so others could be warmer. He mediated disputes with patience and fairness, always bringing discussions back to Joshua's vision. This place was for those who had nowhere else to turn. As Christmas approached, though not everyone celebrated it, they worked together to make the cave feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. Small touches, A carved decoration here, a cleaned and organized space there, efforts to create separate areas that gave each family some sense of privacy and dignity. Emmett used the last of Joshua's gold to buy supplies in town, returning with food, blankets, and materials they needed. The store owner, Henderson, asked about what he was doing with all these purchases. Helping some folks who need it, Emmett said simply. How many folks? 8 at the moment. Henderson whistled low. That's a lot of folks in that cave of yours. You running some kind of boarding house? Something like that, Emmett replied. Word was getting around Riverbend and beyond. The hermit by the river was now housing multiple families. Some people thought he was foolish, wasting resources on people who should solve their own problems. Others, quieter but present, thought he was doing something important, something that honored what the West was supposed to be about, making space for people to start over, to find freedom, to build new lives. On Christmas Eve, Emmett sat outside despite the cold, looking at the stars and thinking about everything that had happened since he'd bought this place for $20 back in August. 4.5 months that had completely transformed his life and his understanding of what mattered. Inside the cave, he could hear quiet singing, Mother Ruth teaching the children a hymn, the Lakota youth sharing a traditional song in return. It was the sound of people finding common ground in uncommon circumstances. He thought about Joshua Freeman, alone in this same space 30 years ago, carving sanctuary from stone and dreaming of the family he'd never see again. Joshua's family hadn't come, but these families had, and more would come. Emmett was certain of that now. The challenge ahead was clear: make this sustainable. Find a way to continue offering sanctuary without depleting the limited resources completely. Create something that would outlast him, that would serve Joshua's vision long after Emmett himself was gone. It seemed impossible. But then again, everything about this situation had seemed impossible from the beginning. An old cowboy buying a cursed cave, finding letters from a dead man, dedicating his final years to completing a stranger's dream, housing 8 desperate people in the middle of winter with almost no resources. Impossible, all of it. And yet happening anyway, one difficult day at a time, because some things were worth making possible through sheer determination and faith that the work mattered. Emmett stood, brushed snow from his clothes, and went back inside to the warmth and the life that now filled Joshua Freeman's sanctuary. There was still so much work to do. But for tonight, Christmas Eve 1886, 8 people who'd had nowhere else to turn were safe and warm in a home built from stone and hope. That was enough. That was everything. Early spring came hesitantly to the canyon in March of 1887. The snow began to melt, revealing brown grass and muddy ground. The river ran higher and louder with runoff from the mountains. Inside the cave, 8 people had found a rhythm of survival that bordered on something like peace. The expanded chambers were functional now, if not comfortable. James's family occupied one space, the Lakota youth another, and Emmett had his corner near the entrance, where he could keep watch. The children had adjusted remarkably well, and the adults had formed working partnerships that made daily life manageable. They were no longer strangers forced together by circumstance. They were something closer to family, but peace in places like this is always temporary. The 3 riders came up the trail on a cold morning in mid-March. Emmett saw them from a distance, men on horseback riding with purpose, one of them wearing something that caught the sun. A badge. His stomach tightened. He'd known this moment might come eventually. You couldn't hide 8 people indefinitely. Word traveled. Questions got asked. And the law, when it decided to pay attention, had long arms. He walked out to meet them at the top of the trail, blocking their path to the cave entrance. Behind him, he heard the door close quietly. Someone inside had seen the riders too and was taking precautions. The lead rider was a man in his 40s, lean and hard-looking, with cold grey eyes and a silver star pinned to his vest. U.S. Marshal, Emmett realized. Not local law, but federal authority. That made this more serious. Morning, the marshal said, his voice flat and professional. I'm Marshal Blackwood. These are my deputies, Carson and Mills. We're looking for some fugitives believed to be in this area. What kind of fugitives? Emmett asked, keeping his voice steady. Blackwood reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers. 2 Lakota youth, male and female, evading federal relocation orders. Also a Negro family, man, woman, 3 children, elderly female, wanted for questioning regarding the burning of property in Colorado. We have reason to believe they're all in this vicinity. Emmett met the marshal's eyes without flinching. This is private property. You'll need a warrant to search it. I got warrants, Blackwood said, tapping the papers in his hand. And I got authority from the territorial government. These aren't suggestions, old man. These are legal orders. He paused, studying Emmett with the practiced assessment of someone who'd faced down many men in many situations. Now I can do this easy or hard. Your choice. But one way or another, I'm going to search that cave and take whoever I find that matches these descriptions. There's nobody here but me, Emmett said firmly. Just an old cowboy living in a hole in the ground. One of the deputies, Carson, snorted. We heard different. Word around Riverbend is you're running some kind of refuge for runaways and troublemakers. Heard you got a whole passel of folks hiding in there. People hear lots of things, Emmett replied. Doesn't make them true. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Step aside. I'm going to look inside that cave. If you're telling the truth and there's nobody there, then we'll apologize for the trouble and ride on. If you're lying, well, that makes you an accessory to federal crimes. That's prison time for a man your age. Probably die behind bars. Emmett didn't move. Like I said, Marshal, private property. You can come back with proper warrants and a territorial judge's signature, and we can discuss it then. The 3 lawmen exchanged glances. The deputies' hands moved closer to their guns. The tension stretched tight as a rope about to snap. Finally, Blackwood spoke, his voice cold with controlled anger. All right, old man. Here's how this is going to work. You got until sunset tomorrow. That's 24 hours. You bring out anyone in that cave who matches these descriptions, or we come in and take them. And if we have to come in, we're taking you too, and charging you with obstruction of justice, harboring fugitives, and anything else I can think of. He leaned forward in his saddle. I follow the law. That's my job. These people are wanted by federal authority. They need to answer for that. Your feelings about it don't matter. He wheeled his horse around, and the 3 lawmen rode back down the trail about a quarter mile, where they set up a visible camp. They weren't leaving. They were watching, waiting, making sure no one could slip away unseen. Emmett stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Then he turned and walked back to the cave. Inside, everyone was gathered in the main chamber. They'd heard enough through the door to understand what was happening. The children clung to their mother, fear bright in their young eyes. James stood with his arm around Rebecca, his jaw set with the resignation of a man who'd expected this moment. The Lakota youth were poised like wild animals ready to bolt, and Mother Ruth sat heavily on a chair, her face gray with exhaustion and worry. What do we do? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emmett looked at each of them, these people who'd found sanctuary in the home that Joshua Freeman had built, these souls who had nowhere else to turn. He thought about Joshua's final letter, about the dream that had died in Missouri 30 years ago, about the promise he'd made to finish what had been started. I'm going into town, he said. I'm going to get help. What kind of help? James asked. We're fugitives. The law is the law. Maybe, Emmett replied, but the law isn't always just, and justice isn't always legal. There are people in Riverbend who know what I'm doing here. Some of them respect it. I'm going to find out if respect means anything when it's tested. It was a desperate plan, maybe even a foolish one. But it was the only plan he had. He looked at them all one more time. And stay inside. Don't make a sound. I'll be back before sunset tomorrow, one way or another. Then he walked out into the cold morning air, climbed onto Junebug's back, and rode toward town, leaving behind 8 frightened people and a dream that was about to face its greatest test. Emmett rode into Riverbend with the desperation of a man running out of time and options. The morning sun was already climbing toward noon, which meant he had maybe 18 hours before Marshal Blackwood's ultimatum expired. 18 hours to convince enough people that what was happening at the cave mattered more than legal technicalities. He started at the general store. Henderson was behind the counter, sorting through a delivery of goods. He looked up as Emmett entered, his expression shifting from welcome to concern when he saw Emmett's face. "What's wrong?" Henderson asked. Emmett told him everything. The family's hiding in the cave. Marshal Blackwood's ultimatum. The choice between surrendering innocent people to injustice or facing federal charges himself. Henderson listened, his expression troubled. When Emmett finished, the store owner was quiet for a long moment. "That's a hard situation," he finally said. "I respect what you're trying to do. But standing against a federal marshal, that's dangerous business. I've got a family to think about, a business to protect. I can't get involved in something that might bring federal trouble to my door." It wasn't the answer Emmett hoped for, but it wasn't unexpected. He tried the blacksmith next, then the owner of the boarding house, then several ranchers who came into town that morning. The responses varied, but the theme was consistent: sympathy for the situation, admiration for Emmett's work, but reluctance to actually stand against federal authority. By early afternoon, Emmett was sitting on a bench outside the church, feeling defeat settle into his bones. He'd been foolish to think he could rally support. People had their own concerns, their own fears. Why would they risk anything for strangers they'd never met? The church door opened, and Reverend Thomas Hayes emerged. He was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd lived a full life before taking up ministry. He'd seen Emmett through the window and came out to sit beside him. "You looked like a man carrying the weight of the world," Hayes said quietly. Emmett told the story again, his voice tired now from repetition and disappointment. He told Hayes about Joshua Freeman, about the sanctuary built from stone and hope, about the 8 people who'd found refuge there, about the marshal who would tear it all apart in the name of following orders. Hayes listened without interrupting. When Emmett finished, the Reverend sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "We preach about compassion every Sunday. We read scriptures about helping the stranger, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless. But it's easy to preach when it costs nothing. The question is whether we mean it when the cost becomes real." He stood and looked down at Emmett. "I think it's time Riverbend decides whether its faith is just words or something more. Come with me." Over the next 4 hours, Reverend Hayes moved through the town like a man on a mission. He went to homes, knocked on doors, pulled people aside in the street. He spoke with passion and conviction about what was happening, about what was at stake, about what kind of community they wanted to be, and slowly, remarkably, people listened. The church women came first, moved by the story of Mother Ruth and the children. Then some of the men who'd heard rumors about Emmett's work and respected it. Then others, drawn by the gathering crowd and the Reverend's compelling arguments about standing for what's right, even when it's difficult. By late afternoon, Hayes had assembled 43 people in the church. They signed a petition, handwritten on several sheets of paper, that declared their support for Emmett Granger and his work providing sanctuary. The wording was careful, crafted by Hayes to walk the line between supporting the cave's mission and not directly defying federal authority. But the message was clear. This community stood with Emmett. More than that, they took up a collection. Coins and bills piled up on a table at the front of the church. When counted, it came to $63, money to help relocate the families legally if needed, to provide supplies, to hire legal representation if it came to that. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Emmett rode back toward the cave. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came 15 townspeople on horses or in wagons, led by Reverend Hayes. They were a delegation, a community making a statement, people willing to stand together for something they believed mattered. The marshal's camp came into view first. Blackwood and his deputies stood as they saw the approaching group, confusion evident on their faces. This wasn't what they'd expected. Emmett rode straight to the cave entrance, and the townspeople arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, creating a human barrier between the lawmen and the cave door. Marshal Blackwood walked over, his hand near his gun but not on it, clearly trying to assess this unexpected development. "What's this?" he demanded. Reverend Hayes stepped forward, holding the petition. "Marshal Blackwood, I'm Reverend Thomas Hayes of the Riverbend Community Church. These people represent our town, and we're here to present this petition supporting Mr. Granger's work and requesting that you reconsider your actions here." Blackwood took the petition, scanned it quickly, his expression hardening. "This doesn't change the law. I have federal warrants. Your signatures don't override my authority." "Perhaps not," Hayes replied calmly. "But before you proceed, we'd like you to meet the people you're planning to arrest. Not as names on warrants, but as human beings with stories worth hearing." At a signal from Emmett, the cave door opened. The families emerged slowly, blinking in the late afternoon sun. James stood tall, holding his daughter Mercy. Rebecca stood beside him with Samuel and Grace. Mother Ruth leaned on the Lakota youth for support. They looked frightened but dignified, meeting the marshal's gaze without shame. Hayes gestured to them. "This is James and his family. Their farm was burned by night riders simply because they dared to own property. They're wanted for questioning about that fire. A fire they were the victims of, not the perpetrators of." He turned to the Lakota youth. "These two are fleeing forced relocation that would separate them from their dying parents. They're wanted for the crime of wanting to stay on their own ancestral lands." Blackwood stood silent, his jaw working as he studied the families. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. He was seeing people, not paperwork. "The law," he began, but Hayes interrupted gently. "The law is meant to serve justice. Is there justice in returning victims to their persecutors? In separating children from dying parents?" He paused. "You're a man who follows orders, Marshal. I respect that. But you're also a man who has to live with the consequences of those orders." The moment stretched out, tense and fragile. Then Blackwood sighed heavily, a man wrestling with duty and conscience. "I'll review these warrants more carefully," he said finally. "If there are questions about their validity or the circumstances, I'll file reports recommending further investigation before any arrests." He looked at Emmett. "That's not a promise they're safe forever. But it's time. Time for them to move on, get somewhere safer, get proper legal help. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't total victory. But it was mercy, and mercy was enough." The tension broke like a dam releasing. Some of the townspeople cheered. Others simply nodded, satisfied that they'd done something that mattered. Marshal Blackwood and his deputies mounted their horses and rode away, leaving the families standing in the fading sunlight, safe for now. Reverend Hayes clasped Emmett's shoulder. "You built something important here. Today, this community decided it was worth defending." As the townspeople dispersed, heading back to Riverbend in the gathering dusk, Emmett stood with the 8 people who'd found sanctuary in Joshua Freeman's cave. They were safe, not permanently, but for now. And sometimes for now is enough. Spring came fully to the canyon in late May of 1887, 9 months after Emmett Granger had bought a cave house for $20 and discovered a purpose he'd never imagined. The cottonwoods were thick with green leaves. Wildflowers dotted the riverside meadow, and the air carried the warmth of coming summer. The cave had changed remarkably. What had been a crude shelter was now a genuine refuge, expanded following Joshua Freeman's original sketches into 3 distinct family chambers, a common area, and proper storage spaces. The legal status had changed too. With Reverend Hayes' help and the support of the town, the cave had been officially recognized as a way station, a place of temporary shelter for travelers in need. It wasn't advertised, but it wasn't hidden either. Those who needed to know about it could find out. The original 8 residents had moved on to build new lives. James and his family had settled on land purchased with help from the church community and several sympathetic ranchers. They were farming again, legitimately this time, with legal protections and neighbors who respected their right to be there. Emmett had received a letter from James just last week, written in careful script, "We will never forget what you did for us. You gave us more than shelter. You gave us time to heal and hope to continue. That gift can never be repaid, only honored by living well." The Lakota youth had been reunited with their parents through legal advocacy coordinated by Reverend Hayes and a territorial lawyer who took their case for free. They were living on land granted to them, not a reservation, but a small homestead where they could honor their traditions while navigating the complicated reality of the changing West. Emmett, now 62 years old, continued as keeper of the sanctuary. The work had changed him visibly. He was leaner, weathered even more deeply by sun and effort, but there was a vitality in his eyes that hadn't been there when he'd first arrived. He moved with purpose now. His days had meaning beyond mere survival. Junebug still grazed by the river, older and moving more slowly, but content in the way animals are when they know their home. Sometimes Emmett talked to her about Joshua Freeman, about the people they'd helped, about the strange journey that had brought an old cowboy and a donkey to become guardians of a dream carved in stone. On a warm afternoon in late May, Emmett completed a project he'd been working on for weeks. Using the skills Lau had taught him and Joshua's own tools, he'd carved a stone marker from a large, flat piece of sandstone. The carving was simple but clear. Joshua Freeman, 1820, 1856, builder of sanctuary. His dream lives, he placed the marker at the cave entrance, setting it into the ground where anyone who approached would see it. That evening, he sent word to Riverbend, and the next day, a small gathering assembled at the cave. Reverend Hayes was there, along with Henderson from the general store, several church members, and a handful of others who'd come to respect what this place represented. Hayes spoke briefly about legacy, about how the best of us leave behind not possessions, but possibilities, not wealth, but hope for those who come after. Then he led a simple prayer, and the townspeople filed past the marker, each touching the stone as they went, a gesture of respect for a man they'd never known, but whose work had touched their lives. After everyone left, Emmett sat at his table and opened his journal. He'd been keeping meticulous records, and he counted them now. 23 people in 9 months. 23 souls who'd found sanctuary in Joshua Freeman's cave, who'd been helped and sent on their way to build better lives. Some had stayed only a night. Others, like James's family, had stayed for weeks. Each one had a story, and each story mattered. He thought about his own transformation. He'd come here to disappear, to fade away quietly in a place where no one would notice or care. Instead, he'd found something he'd been missing his entire life without knowing it. The understanding that your life matters not because of what you accumulate or achieve, but because of how you help others become who they're meant to be. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Sarah, the widow he'd helped back in October, standing there with her 2 children. They were healthier now, dressed better, smiling with the confidence of people who'd found stability. "Mr. Granger," Sarah said warmly, "we were passing through on our way to visit my brother, and I couldn't go by without stopping. I wanted the children to see this place again, to remember where we found help when we needed it most." Young Samuel, now looking stronger and more grown up at 8 years old, stepped forward shyly. "Ma says you're a hero, sir. That you help people when nobody else will." Emmett shook his head gently. "I'm just a keeper, son. This place is the hero. The man who built it, he's the hero. I just try to honor what he started." Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. "You gave us more than supplies and a fixed wagon. You gave us proof that goodness exists in the world, that there are still people who care about strangers, who help without asking for anything in return. My children will grow up knowing that, and they'll pass it on to their children. That's how one act of compassion ripples out forever." After they left, Emmett stood at the cave entrance watching the sun set over the canyon, painting the rock formations in shades of gold and red. The river murmured its constant song below. Junebug dozed in her shelter. Everything was peaceful, complete. He thought about Joshua Freeman standing in this same spot 30 years ago, dreaming of bringing his family to safety, building sanctuary with his own scarred hands. dying in pursuit of a dream that seemed impossible. Joshua's family never came, but so many others had. The sanctuary had served its purpose, just not in the way Joshua had imagined. Movement on the trail caught his attention. Two people were making their way down from the north, a young couple by the looks of them, moving with the exhaustion of people who'd been traveling hard and running from something. They saw the cave, saw Emmett standing there and hesitated. Emmett raised his hand in welcome. The universal gesture, "You're safe here." They approached slowly, and as they got close enough for him to see their faces clearly, frightened, desperate but hoping, he smiled. "Come in," he said, stepping back from the door. "You're safe here. Let me tell you about the man who built this place and why it exists. Let me tell you about Joshua Freeman and the dream that lives in these stones." The work continued. The sanctuary remained, and somewhere, in whatever place held the spirits of those who'd lived and died for what they believed in, Joshua Freeman knew that his dream hadn't died with him. It had just been waiting for the right keeper to finish what he'd started. And now it would continue, helping people they'd never meet, offering sanctuary to the desperate and hope to the forgotten, one soul at a time. For as long as the river flowed and the stones stood firm, some legacies are measured in gold or fame or power. Others are measured in the quiet transformation of lives, in shelter offered when shelter is desperately needed, in proof that compassion still exists in a hard world. Emmett Granger had come to this cave with $20 silver and no purpose beyond surviving a few more years. He'd become the keeper of something that mattered more than he could have imagined. A sanctuary built by one man's love and maintained by another man's determination to honor that love. The work would go on. The cave would outlast him, just as it had outlasted Joshua. And that was exactly as it should be. Because the best legacies aren't the ones we keep for ourselves. They're the ones we pass on to those who come after, incomplete and imperfect, but full of possibility and hope. The river flowed on. The stones stood firm, and sanctuary remained, carved from rock and sustained by the simple truth that sometimes one person's compassion really can change the world.